This is the Compass Podcast, where we connect the spiritual to the everyday. My name is Ryan.
My name is Pierce.
We're so glad to have you with us. Today, we have an interview with a fierce lady named Rachel Billups. Pierce, what has you excited about this episode?
She gives us a lot of great things to think about and to move forward. Rachel's an incredible voice in our church denomination because we are United Methodist. The thing I love the most is how she talks about two things. One, hearing voices. She calls them prophecies. People think that that's a very church word, right? Prophecy.
Yeah, it's kind of a loaded term sometimes.
It's a loaded term, but this kind of idea of people speaking over you, speaking things in you, and that you carry with you. And so often those things that people speak over us are limiting the call that God has on our life. So she speaks to that, which I think she just does a beautiful job of. And then the other back end of the interview, we talk a lot about not the difference of, but the how we carry so often being fearful and being fierce at the same time. And how do we live into that? And she breaks it apart really well for us.
Cool. Yep. So interview with Reverend Rachel Billups. She's helping us find our fierce next. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us here on the Compass Podcast. What does our friend who's listening to this conversation need to know about who you are? Who is Rachel Billups?
You know, that is a fascinating conversation. Who are you?
Isn't it?
Well, I think it would be important. Like, there are three things that you absolutely have to know about me. Number one, I'm a competitor when it comes to board games. Number two, even though I'm a really hard-charging human, I am a sucker for my 2-year-old daughter, Sarah. She rules my life, right? Okay. By the way, I have 3 other children, but it's just Sarah that got
it's just Sarah. Is Sarah the youngest?
She's the youngest.
Okay.
So,
we're just hoping the other 3 don't listen to this podcast. That's what we're hoping.
Okay. So, well, that is true because so this is a bit of a tangent, but I have these 3 other children. I have a 14-year-old daughter, Adeline, an 11-year-old son, Topher, and a 6-year-old son, David. And Topher and Adeline listen to podcasts. And in fact, I've got Topher hooked onto Malcolm Gladwell.
Whoa.
Yeah, I know. And I have to
enlightened child.
And so he's always just the other day, we were talking, and I'm listening to Malcolm Gladwell's Talking to Strangers, which is awesome, but it's a little raw. And I didn't realize, we thought all the kids were in that car, and at the beginning we were listening to it, and he's like, Mom, I totally listened to chapter 1. I'm cool. And I'm like, dang it.
We're already this far in.
That's
you can't
good.
pull the plug on it now.
I'm caught. Anyhow, competitive at board games. I'm just competitive in general. I'm a sucker for Sarah. And honestly, I absolutely love human beings. Period. Exclamation mark. I just think human beings are amazing. Messy, but amazing. So, and I happen to be married to my high school sweetheart, and we've been married 18 years, and I happen to work at a church named Ginghamsburg.
Yeah.
There's a lot of other things, but those are the most important.
Yeah, which is Dayton, Ohio. And Ginghamsburg is around the Methodist world is pretty well known. It's one of the larger churches in the Methodist connection. How did you end up? Well, maybe we'll get really theological here. How did you experience your call to ministry?
Yeah, I'm not your quintessential pastor's kid. In fact, I always say I won the lottery when it came to my parents because I grew up in this place called the Hocking Hills, which is on the edges of Appalachia in southern Ohio.
Okay.
And my mom and dad, my dad was a factory worker, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom until she became, she worked at a gas station / supermarket / post office / beer run place, that kind of thing. And so I didn't come from this long lineage of religious people. But my mom and dad took me to church when I was a kid. And I love all my family, but of my cousins, my brother, sister, and I are the only ones with college degrees. And certainly my life, the narrative for my life has not been the narrative that I've lived out. And so I feel my life is pretty much a miracle, a total miracle. And so I grew up in a church of 50 on a great Sunday. And
Yeah.
I have a gathering at my house. We do this thing called open table. And we decided the weather's going to be crap for Halloween. So, hey, let your kids trick or treat in my kitchen. And so we already have like 50 people coming over.
Yeah.
So it's just like such a strange phenomenon. So as a kid, people would speak into my life and say, I really think you're supposed to do something special for God. And as a teenager, I was trying to figure out what that would mean because I was super nerdy, athlete, but super nerdy. And I wanted to do something like go teach chemistry in a college in India, you know? But then I began to feel this pull toward preaching and pastoral ministry. I first articulated that as like, I told my mom one day, I think I'm called to be a preacher's wife. Well, I'm not. And
is that from what you had just simply seen?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't see any women who are preachers. I mean, Joyce Meyer on TV, like that was about it. And so I didn't have a picture. I didn't have a paradigm for that. And I ended up, I was really wrestling when I was getting into college. I started out as a Bible and religion and art major because I loved art. I couldn't figure out exactly what I was going to do when I grew up. I loved art and chemistry and, all the things.
Yeah, I guess, this is what you talk about when you say, like, I just love humanity. Like, you just love all this knowledge of.
And I just love all the things. But I kept being pulled into, like, pastoral ministry. And I ended up getting a degree in Bible and religion and history. I made my way to Duke Divinity School, all the while thinking that maybe I'd get a PhD and teach in a college. And then I worked at a homeless shelter my first semester, and it wrecked me. And I said, I got to be where the people are. I can't just live my life in books. And so I got to be where the people are. And so that really started a journey toward the local church. And let me tell you, I mean, I was in seminary 2000. I graduated December 2006. And if you would have said to that Rachel, who was, by the way, working at a church as a direct hire youth pastor / outreach pastor, I was bargaining my pay. I lived in the parsonage and I worked for living in the parsonage kind of thing.
What was it about that homeless shelter experience that wrecked you? What was the eye-opening experience?
Well, I think, one of the things that I really, really, really remember is here I was, this kid that pretty much grew up in the country my entire life. It's not like I ended up at Anderson University, which is in Anderson, Indiana. It's about a town of 60,000 people, so it's not like a booming metropolis or anything. And Durham was like the biggest place I'd ever lived in my life, and probably the most diverse place I'd ever lived in my life. And I'm working in this Urban Ministries of Durham homeless shelter. I'm exposed to a socioeconomic reality that, homelessness was not my reality ever. And, racially diverse group of people, Hispanic, Black, just an exceptionally diverse group of people. What I realized is people let me in a way that they should have never let me in very quickly because I didn't act as though I was better than anybody else. I was just really myself. Like I would sit and eat with people and have conversations with them or, let people braid my hair because they wanted to or, just really became part of folks' lives and treated them as humans and as fellow brothers and sisters, And I realized like, oh, that's what people really want, to be seen. And I didn't feel like I could see people if I was behind a book. And so, even now I'm the senior pastor of one of the largest churches in Methodism, but I still crave being where the people are. So on any given Sunday morning or Saturday night, I'm talking to people, I'm hugging people, I'm shaking hands, I'm kissing babies, I'm crying with people, because I'm just I'm a kid that grew up in the country that just was given a shot that I should have never been given. And how could I think that anybody was any better than I am? That's what, So it just wrecked me and said, I got a choice to make, I can spend my life in books and do a beautiful thing with the next generation. So, that's not terrible. I have in fact, someday I might grow up and get my PhD, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I just knew that if I was going to give my life to something, it was going to be in the local church.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
beautiful. As you talk about meeting with people and, like that's your heart, you hear a lot of their stories in that, obviously, and you carry your own story into that. And as you have this phrase that you talk about, limitation prophecy. And it's kind of this thing of like, we all like, I actually got into the studio today like 30 minutes early, which is not normal for me because I'm like running from place to place as we all do. And I just put it on my calendar for 30. I had to put it on my calendar for a little early. So me and Ryan got to catch up, and we're just talking about like the obstacles that we're facing in life. And, like we're all carrying that to some degree or another. And so that limitation prophecy that you talk about, like how would you define that?
I think it's really any kind of negative word, any like limiting word that you heard spoken over you at any point in your life that really like caught you up or like made you feel like, okay, I got to stay in my lane. There's a category and I need to stay in it, And certainly my life, particularly my younger years, are full of those, full of those limitation prophecies.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you were gifted with this very clear idea of a sense of calling. I think a lot of us hear your story and you're like, man, I wish it came that strong, especially at such a young age. So as you were articulating that to other people, like what kind of limitation prophecies were they speaking back to you?
Oh my gosh. Just this last weekend, I was telling a story about, I had this group. So I probably was a teenager, and remember I grew up in this really small place, and I was at this little festival in a town called Guyvotsonville, right? So like it's not even a town, it's not even a village, it's like a place on a map, right? And they used to have this firemen's festival or something like that. I don't even know what that is, what it was called, but I remember being there, and there were these two gentlemen that I had somehow met in the church world. Like it's like in some ways like young Christians kind of knew other young Christians. And I think they were in like their early 20s and I'm in my teens. And they're talking to me about like my call, and they seem really, really affirming, and they're talking to me and I'm like, this is great. Like I'm saying, hey, I feel like I'm called to be in ministry, maybe even as a preacher. And they say, can we pray over you? Two of my Baptist brothers. And I said, oh, sure. Yeah, you can pray over me. No problem. And so and they're praying this beautiful Yeah, sounds great. They're praying this beautiful prayer, and then they get to this part where they say, and God, we're so glad that Rachel has stepped up into this calling because there was a man who refused to step up into his calling, and you're now choosing her because he didn't do what he was supposed to do. And I'm like, in that moment, as a teenager, I'm like, you better stop praying right now. No, I mean, as a teenager, I'm like, I cannot believe you're praying this over me. Because I don't think I was God's second choice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, so it shocked me. Like I thought you were affirming my call, but in reality, you were saying, no, you're only called because someone else didn't choose to receive their call.
Wow.
And so, it's a few years later.
Yeah.
And I still can feel the pain of that prayer.
Thank you for sharing that. How important is that for just all of us to hear, but especially our female listeners that, in the church world, we're coming off of a pastor of notable, carries a lot of weight in the American church, talking about another female who we would call a pastor.
Yeah.
And he did not have that language for her. And not only did not have that theological understanding, but then just was putting his theological points in a way that were just demeaning and lacking of humanity in my eye. And so to hear you say, and for, our female listeners, for all our listeners, but for our female listeners in the season to go like, you're not God's second choice. You are God's choice, and God's call is on your life. And it's beautiful.
So Rachel, where did that kind of voice show up for you? That voice that says that you are God's called, that you are not limited by what some of these other prophecies are saying about you. Like what were the voices that spoke counter to those prophecies of limitation?
It's so fascinating. There were a couple of folks that you wouldn't think that these would be the early voices, but I remember being a senior in high school, and that's when the intranet first came out. And so we were like chatting online in a computer class that I was taking.
Was that on AIM?
Okay?
Was that on AIM, AOL Instant Messenger?
I don't remember, but it was probably around that time. And so we were, my computer professor, we were typing and talking to people, in some other part of the country, which seemed like amazing to us at the time, right? And so this gentleman, I was talking about like what I want to do, and I'm a high school student, and I'm thinking I'm going to be a pastor in the future. And he just started telling me why I couldn't do that, and telling me I was going to go to hell if I did that. And my computer professor stood right beside me and said, "You need to say this next. You're called to do this. You need to say this." So he literally was defending me, helping me to defend myself against this person, this random human online. And I don't know if he knew Jesus. I don't know if he was religious. I just know that he saw what he saw, and he said, "No, she's called to do this. You don't know her," And so, in fact, the other thing I just ran into, this is wild. So I probably live at least hour and a half, maybe 2 hours from my high school that I grew up in. And so I'm clearly not in the same community. And I was eating lunch with someone today, and I was at this restaurant in our little town here in Tip City, Ohio. And I ran into my high school history teacher. And he was one of those teachers that in high school just said, "Rachel, you could do and be whatever you want to be. And I know whatever you're going to do, it's going to be amazing." So it wasn't just the like religious stuff, like the you're called by God to do something big for Jesus. It was it were those voices in school and in athletics and in other places and spaces that said, with work, if you focus in on this, you're going to become amazing. And I actually listened to those people and believed what they said. And so I'm like, okay, that sounds good. I want that. And just kind of leaned into that. And those voices, they felt more like God than the negative voices. They felt more like, hey, I believe that person. I think that, isn't it interesting that it's the folks who are fighting for, defending or even encouraging are the voice of God rather than the negative detractors. You see what I'm saying? And I think it would help us as humans when we're trying to figure out, like, what am I supposed to do? What's my purpose? I want to know that my life has meaning. As we listen for what's that meaning in our life, whether we have faith or not, listen to those encouraging voices. Listen to those folks who are saying, "I think you can do this," rather than those folks who are trying to put you in a container, say, "No, stay in your lane. That's not for you."
Do you mean that, like, when you talk about the voice of God, are you kind of intoning that we have this idea that, like, God is the God of judgment, and that's why we feel like that voice of God is sometimes negative?
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess then as you come across humanity and where you find Jesus, like, we do become aware that, well, I guess that in one way God is the God of judgment, but that judgment is through the lens of Jesus, which says that I judge you good and worthy and something pretty incredible.
Yeah.
Well, how do you, are there ways that you cultivate a relationship with those kind of, well, we'll just call them like the godlike voices now? I would understand that in your position today, in a position of leadership, that you probably hear some prophecy of limitation, or in the least, like a fair amount of criticism. So how do you cultivate a constant feed of like the upbuilding voices today?
Yeah, I get my share of nasty grams weekly. So, there certainly are a lot of folks who want to speak limitation prophecies over me even today. So, humans are human, and sometimes they're sweet and sometimes they're not so sweet. I think the most effective way that I cultivate those godlike voices in my life, I have a group of women that I meet with every other week we actually are in different places in the state of Ohio, but we meet together on Zoom every other week. And we call ourselves a covenant group. A group of women, the other women in this group, the other three are clergy. And so we've been together for 7 or 8 years. And what I love about this group of women is they are continually championing me, right? Like, but if I'm being dumb, because I can be dumb, or if I need like a healthy voice to speak some rationality into me, they're not afraid to do that too. And so it's not all like, it's not all like butterflies and sweet parades, like
it's not a constant pep talk.
Yeah, it's not a constant pep talk. Sometimes it's like, hey, you really shouldn't be doing that, or like, where are your boundaries in that, or you're working way too much. Do you think you're Superwoman? What are you doing? So I love these women because I know that they love me, and frankly, I know that they're for me, and so I can trust them with that kind of piece. I think. And I certainly have a lot of layers of that. I'm in another women's life group. I'm in life groups. I'm in, and then I have mentors in my life that just really do speak God possibilities over me. And then when I see some peers who are doing amazing ministry throughout the country, we're always just like championing one another, like your buddy Jacob Armstrong. I mean, it's folks like that I'm inspired by what they're doing. And I want to, on the regular, when we see one another, we're just showering one another with like, hey, you are just killing it. And I love what God's doing through you.
Yes, I want to take a little bit of a turn here. And you're leading a church now where your staff and key volunteers is much larger than even the church you grew up in,
Oh, heck yeah.
And so with that, knowing the power of your words, of God promises as prophecy, as encouragement, how does that play out in your day-to-day office leadership with your staff?
I do believe, like, what's so interesting about Ginghamsburg Church, we are a really hard-charging church, and certainly we're a church that really thrives for, like, we want to do things fun and we want to do them well, right? We want to be fun and we want to do things well. And so we try to create environments of trust where we can, if we need to say hard things, we can say hard things.
Yeah.
But we don't take those hard things personally. And I think that's a really growing edge for our church, but for churches in general. How do you find this balance between constantly encouraging one another? We do something every week. We have a staff gathering where at the beginning of the staff gathering, we do this thing that we call God sightings, which is just like, every way that you've seen God. And a lot of times we're just elevating people through the staff team that are like, oh, I saw God through this person doing children's ministry, or that person, it's just a way for us to encourage one another as well. And then we have something called the hot seat, where we have a staff person that tells us their God story. And then we're able to ask any question that we want. And it's just a really encouraging time for that person. And so we just want to create a culture that, frankly, people like to work at, and you can't create that culture by being like highly critical all the time. At the same time, I recognize, like, in ministry, I'm sure that I've been someone's limitation prophecy. Like, they'll look back and they'll be like, when that woman said that, because you're in a place of authority, you don't even mean to sometimes. Like, you have to be really careful as a pastor, because you don't even, maybe you're joking, or maybe you're just like, hey, don't do that. That's silly. And people receive that as a limitation prophecy, even if it wasn't like communicated in that way. So words matter. And I think as people, particularly if you're a leader, if you're a person that are in any organization that is leading other people, recognizing that your words do have power. They do have the power to build up, and they have the power to tear down, and to make sure that even when you're quote unquote, tearing down people, even when you're giving people constructive feedback, you're doing it in such a way that is clear, that is direct, that is, but is caring at the same time. Don't make it sweet and then just pretend you've said something hard.
Yeah.
Like, be scared, be direct, but be caring in that moment. And frankly, as a 38-year-old, I've screwed that up a few times.
Yeah.
Over the years. So I'm learning how to not allow those hard things to be limitation prophecies.
Do you ever find that some of your staff like would rather have the critical voice than the uplifting? You're doing this great. You're awesome. That they would rather have the tell me how to do it better so I can be better voice. Does that make sense?
Yes, I do have a few staff like that who are like their first thought is, how can we improve on this?
Mm-hmm.
Because they're maximizers, right? They really want to grow, and it's difficult for them to celebrate, or even sit there and enjoy, have some gratitude for what they just experienced,
Yeah.
Frankly, I probably am a little bit like that, in the sense that, don't get me wrong, I like encouragement, but for the most part, I'm like, okay, I did that. Fantastic. Move on. Now what? How can I improve on this next thing that I'm going to do?
Yeah. I just pulled the old, I've got a friend dealing with this and it's really just me. Yeah. I do not do well with you did awesome at that. It's just just tell me how I did bad and I can make it better. That's definitely my go-to.
Yeah. And I actually think gratitude is the solution for that. Because I think one of the pieces is disciplining yourself to say, let me be grateful for this moment that God has given me, and not just want to move on to, okay, so we're getting into a whole conversation about humans and emotion and identity and all that kind of thing. I really believe that a lot of times we struggle with encouragement and we struggle with criticism, or giving it or receiving it, because we don't trust who we are. Mm-hmm. We don't have a firm identity in, hey, I'm a beloved child of the living God, and so that's who I am, and it doesn't matter what anybody else says, good or bad, about me. But when we are when we have a spiritual insecurity about us, or just an insecurity in general, then suddenly that criticism is more than just what it was at the surface. It derails us. Or that praise is more than just a praise. It's no, it can't be that good because I'm still a big time work in progress. And so I just think it's important for us to continually, I always say, I just preach this to my congregation, to the church over the weekend. I believe that if every single human being understood their identity as a beloved child of God, look out, the gates of hell could not prevail against us. Yeah. And so it is probably the single single greatest indicator of someone's spiritual health. Do they have a firm identity in who they are?
So how do you ramp up that identity? How do you really be reminded or get in touch with that voice?
Remember the group that I just described to you?
Yeah.
I think it both takes introspection, so being self-aware, which is really difficult in the Christian community. Being self-aware, just am I thinking of myself too much? But honestly, I think sometimes in the Christian community, we actually think of ourselves too little. Sure, there's some arrogance. Arrogance can happen, but a lot of times we're God could possibly never do that for me. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. All that kind of stuff. I hear that way more often than I hear an arrogance in our Christian community, frankly. And so I think it's recognizing that, but I also think it's recognizing kind of that inward stuff, but also having those voices around you that lovingly can help you see, giving you kind of the guardrails that you need to say, no, I'm delightfully human, and I love this, and I love that God's walking me in this journey. And as a Methodist, I'm a work in progress that's working on toward perfection, and just being at ease with right where I am.
So being at ease at where you are and at that peace, and then at the same time, you wrote a book called Fierce.
I know.
Finding your fears. Yeah. Be bold, finding your fears. So.
Yeah. Being fierce and being at peace. So is being that fierce side something that comes naturally?
No, being afraid comes naturally.
Oh, really?
Like I think fear is like, I could tell you like story after story where I decided that I wasn't going to do something because I was scared. Even something as simple, when I was like a teenager, even in my early 20s, I hated to drive to a new place because I had no idea how to get there. And I was terrified the whole time. Now, this is probably because I grew up in kind of an isolated place, but I was terrified the whole time that I'd like not get there or go the wrong way or whatever. And so sometimes I chose just not to go because I was afraid of the experience and just, I was asked to do things early on in my ministry career. In my book, I talk about, I was asked twice to speak at Goodson Chapel at Duke Divinity School. And I said no twice. And I had some legit excuses, but the reality is it was just plain old fear. I didn't want Dr. Stanley Hauerwas to light me up, college, or my peers to be like, oh, that was okay, Yeah. And so I let that fear paralyze me. So in some ways, yes, fear. But then there's this other weird part of what I did have modeled growing up. My mother was like such a quiet, meek human being, very like kind of a wallflower. But both of my grandmothers, my mom's mom and my dad's mom, were bold women. Like I always say that my grandma Ruby could cuss the flowers off of wallpaper. I mean, they just spoke their mind. And I feel like my parents used to call me Little Ruby when I was growing up because I had a temper and I could cuss real well. And I speak my mind. And so even though I could speak my mind, it didn't mean that I was going to do that next thing that God was calling me to do. So there was this combo of fear and bold. And then when I started channeling that and recognizing like, hey, that's just fear, and calling it out and stepping forward in what I would call faith, suddenly I was able to like claim the fear, claim the bold, and let go of the fear. Yeah, fear isn't always a terrible thing. Fear does keep us alive. I think there is a place for us, but it's when fear paralyzes us that it's just such a debilitating force in our life. I always say, like, I had enough naivete to believe that I do things that, like, other people are like, why on earth? Like, why would this little girl from the Hocking Hills ever think that she could go to Duke Divinity School? Because I just thought I could. And I tried, and I got there. So, but at the same time, while I'm there, I'm like, I can't preach. Forget it. That's terrifying, So it's a mixture. And I bet most of our listeners find that in themselves, a mixture of fierce and fear. It's not just like we're all one or the other. I mean, I'm still scared out of my mind sometimes, like, and people at this church don't believe me. When they read this book, they were like, I cannot believe how afraid you are all the time. They're like, you seem so strong all the time. And I think part of it is I'm in a mega church. And so therefore you're on the platform. People don't see the behind the scenes, worry and fret. And even though I'm pretty vulnerable on the platform too, I think people there's a little bit of projection too going on there. Like, no, I just talked about how I was scared out of my mind and you didn't hear that part. You just saw me on the platform and thought, there ain't no way. I don't believe that,
Yeah, right. Or that you were even bold enough, like, oh man, she's so brave to even admit that she's afraid in front of this many people.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's just really important so as I was sharing with folks that, I'm afraid of a lot. I mean, we've been in what I would call a challenging season at Ginghamsburg. We transitioned a pastor, Mike Slaughter, who was here for 38 years. And then we had what turned out to be an interim pastor, Chris Eckerman, for 2.5 years. And midstream, so to speak. One day I was the Tip City campus pastor, and the next day I was the interim senior pastor. So, yeah, so you can imagine the amount of fear and worry and criticism and limitation prophecies that came with that.
So where can people pick up the book?
Well, certainly just about anywhere that you can buy books, frankly. I always encourage people, like, go to a bookstore and pick it up. Like, go to your local store, just so you can smell the pages, But there are other places. I mean, like, Amazon, Cokesbury, et cetera, et cetera. So,
now, have you done, we talked about earlier about podcast and kind of that, because is there an audio version of the book?
Oh, yeah. So it's on Audible.
Love it.
Yeah, so there's an audio, and I'm the version.
Yes.
So I'm reading my own book. I was really kind of adamant about that because I wanted you to hear, well, particularly I wanted you to hear the emotion.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I wanted you to hear my story. By the way, my favorite chapter in the entire book, I didn't write like chapter 1, chapter 2. I started and I read chapter 8. I wrote chapter 8 first.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
And if I didn't write the book for any other reason but chapter 8, yeah, I wrote it for chapter 8.
Yeah.
Well, Rachel, is there any spot that folks can get a hold of you online to keep track with what you're doing?
Yeah, you can check out my Instagram. I think it's RL Billups. It's my Instagram, it's my Twitter as well, but I'm not too keen on that too often. But I'm also Rachel Billups on Facebook as well.
Cool. All right. We'll link that stuff up on the show notes. Well, thank you so much for your time today. This has been inspiring.
Thank you.
Thank you, friend, for sharing this journey with us as well. If you would be bold or fierce enough to leave a rating or review on your podcast platform of choice, Piers and I would super appreciate that. Want to thank for making this episode possible the crew at United Methodist Communications, who, well, reserves our space, gives us the technology, hosts everything for us. You're all amazing. And of course, thank you for making this possible by giving us your time and your ears and your attention. Until next time, be well.